Hey, welcome back to another episode of Keeping Cozy. Today we have a really cool guest, Akshay Bhargava of Malwarebytes, a cybersecurity company based in California. He's going to talk to us a little bit about cybersecurity as well as his journey from being an immigrant to the United States to going to Carnegie Mellon and then also MIT and then, getting into the infamously hard to get into place McKinsey. So if that sounds interesting for you, please stay tuned and I hope you enjoy this video. Thanks again for your time. Hey Akshay, well, thank you so much for coming to the podcast, and I hope you've been well.
I've been well, yeah. Thank you, Jacob. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
How are things in California?
Things are okay. I mean, obviously we're in the middle of a pandemic, and then we also have the fire situation happening right now. We have a number of fires blazing through Northern California. So just my hope and prayer to everyone in the Northern Bay Area and California overall. Hope everyone's safe.
Yeah. No, I echo that statement. So let's get started. Could you tell us a little bit about your career? Malwarebytes and McKinsey and all of the other Carnegie Mellon as a computer scientist. Could you walk us through it?
Yeah, sure, happy to. So I started my career as a computer scientist. I went to Carnegie Mellon to get my BS in computer science. And then I went on to be a software engineer, and then eventually ended up at MIT Sloan. So at MIT Sloan, I did my MBA with a focus in entrepreneurship and innovation. And from MIT, I went on to McKinsey and Company. So at McKinsey, I served a lot of C-level executives as well as board of directors on various different topics, and mostly in the tech space. So related to technology, serving many variety of different companies. And then there I went on to work in cybersecurity because that was a theme that I kept hearing over and over from a lot of clients. So I went on to work at a company called FireEye, and then I was an executive at Oracle, and I'm currently the chief product officer at Malwarebytes, which is a cybersecurity company focused to help consumers as well as corporations stay safe and secure.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about your passion for technology and kind of is cybersecurity always been a threat that's existed since the start of computing, or is it just gone much and much worse as we've gone on?
It's a great question. I think cybersecurity has been a threat always, ever since the technology has become available. Ways bad guys are trying to take advantage of technology for nefarious purposes. What's happened recently, Jacob, is that the level of threats, the amount of threats, and the sophistication of those threats have drastically increased. And so a few examples here. We're living in a pandemic right now. We got COVID going on. So it's amazing. The type of threats that we're seeing now there's a lot of new scams, new techniques of malware that are taking advantage of COVID. So for example, there's impersonation of the World Health Organization as an example that's being used to propagate malware. So what you're seeing is cyber threats have always been around. They have been increasing, and attackers are very sophisticated and they take advantage of the current situation to cause fear and also take advantage to monetize.
Yeah. So, well, here's a question, for someone who's not particularly well-versed on, cybersecurity and like big data, what is the interplay between the two of them? Because you see a lot of people, talking about the dangers of big data and, like Facebook harvesting data. Is that something we should be afraid of, especially because of malware and things like that? Or is it totally interdependent?
No, there is a strong relationship there. And on one hand, data can help, lots of data about threats, about individuals can help build better cybersecurity. On the other hand, having a lot of data and information about a specific individual or specific company can help an attacker make a very, very compelling, very targeted attack. So data can both be an ally to help build better cybersecurity. It can also be an ally to cyber criminals who are trying to create very targeted attacks.
Yeah. And so here's something that's kind of, I know you've written about it, but could you talk a little bit about the Cambridge Analytica scandal? And, is that something at all related to cybersecurity, or is that something, that is just a big data concern?
So I think when you think about that as a broader genre of issue, fundamentally boils down to individuals' privacy and how your consumers' privacy is being captured and how it's being utilized. And today, one of the big problems is, as a consumer, I don't even know who has access to my data, how it's being used. And and so whether it's being used for nefarious purposes or for purposes that I would not endorse, I may not even be in the loop or know that. Now, when you think about Cambridge Analytica, essentially they're able to capture a lot of data about individuals, use that data to understand which individuals are more likely to be influenced, and then use that in their favor to try and influence people. So as an individual, if you knew that you're being targeted and that your opinions may be trying to be manipulated, people don't have a way to opt in or out to that, right? So that's part of the gist of what this topic is touching on, right?
Yeah. So can you elaborate on opting in? Is that like, is this something in the future that, we're going to have greater control over where our data is used? Or is this something that, is,
There's
kind
a
of,
lot of
yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, Jacob, I think there are some different regulations that's out there. There's some different proposals around how consumers should have more control over the data and how it's being used. Consumers should have the option to opt in and out. So that is something that new regulation is being recommended and mandated in certain cases. But I think the bigger challenge, Jacob, is that most consumers don't have that level of sophistication, that level of insight or knowledge of how data about them can be used against them. And so that is part of the education and awareness. And a lot of people don't even think that managing their privacy or protecting their privacy is so important. And part of that is because they don't understand the downsides of that.
Yeah. Well, what are why should I care? Like when I think of, I'm using Google, I'm using Facebook, I, post this on YouTube. Those are like really helpful tools that I'm using to promote my podcast. But why should I care that they're trying to monetize off of my data?
Yeah. And so I think that two things. I think one is that it depends on your comfort level, right? I think on one hand, as long as you understand what the threats are and you're okay with that, that's a point of view. But a lot of people, as they learn more about how this data can be used, against you or used in conjunction to have you fall prey for scams or other things, or find your vulnerabilities and take advantage of it, people become more concerned about what data should be allowed and how it should be allowed to be used of it.
So what could happen? What could happen? Like what is, like the worst case scenario for people, like I don't think people understand like what the visual, like this is what will have, this is, the boogeyman of big data and cybersecurity.
Yeah. So I think there's a few different things that can happen now. And I'll give you a few examples of different types of threats that exist. Now, there's no one source that will make those things happen, but I'll just give you a few different examples. So one type of threat that I've talked quite a bit about that's emerging recently are threats like stalkerware, right? So stalkerware essentially provides an abuser access to an individual with information about their location, potentially can compromise their bank information, all their history. So that is a real extreme case where your privacy is completely violated, right? So that's an example where, if you think about it today, Jacob, how much of your life exists on your phone, right? Right? So like who you're talking to, when you're talking to them, where you are, your bank information, your social media, all of that resides in your phone. So having access to that, people can have a deep, intimate access to everything about you. And if they manipulate or use that, maybe that's your bank account to steal money from you. It could be your location to track where you are. And in some cases, even, and in the case of an abuser, to be able to find you when you may want to avoid that person. So that's kind of one extreme, if you will, of how having access to information can be used against you. There's a lot of other scenarios. There's other scenarios that you may say are maybe a bit milder, but also for a lot of people are not great scenarios. So for example, COVID, and during COVID, the number of COVID scams that are happening are at an all-time high. And so the Federal Trade Commission reported that in the first few months of COVID, there were over 14,000 scams and took away $10 million from consumers in the United States who fell for these scams. And a lot of these scams were things like, hey, would you like to learn about COVID? Would you like to learn about how you can protect yourself from COVID? So these scams also, with people, when information about individuals is known, they can be highly targeted for some of these scams, email phishing campaigns, and lots
Yeah.
of things.
So yeah, pivoting this to young adults and young professionals and college students, what is the biggest concern for them? Like, I think we're a little bit more savvy than when you think of like traditional internet scams. You think of like the email, the Nigerian Prince wants, $5,000 and he'll give you $1 billion in return. So young people, I think, are a bit savvier than that. But what would happen for people like me who are, a little bit more savvy than to fall for, an email scam like that, but probably are not going to like understand the complexities of big data, cybersecurity issues?
Yeah, so I think, Jacob, the thing that I think every young person should understand is the threats out there are much broader than just the Nigerian Prince. And guess what? One of the groups of people that innovate the fastest and are the quickest to use new technology are also cyber criminals, right? And cyber criminals continue to become more savvy. They continue to build attacks that are very targeted, and they're very persistent. So I think the first thing that people should understand, young people, is that cyber threats are not going away. Cyber threats are only rising. And I don't know, one of the things that I noticed is a lot of younger people use Macs. That's a trend. The number of Macs is growing. Well, guess what? Did you know this, Jacob? The number of Mac threats is the fastest growing platform with threats. There's more Mac threats, that Malwarebytes has discovered per device than on Windows machines. Well, that's a huge new trend. So I think one of the things that young people should realize is that they need to be more proactive and take ownership of protecting their devices, protecting their identity, and protecting their privacy.
Yeah. And how do we do that?
So the first step, so there's a few things that I'd recommend. The first thing is, and it sounds like people like you may be already very sharp on this, but just understanding how social engineering and some of these threats work, because that way you'll be less prone to falling prey to them. The second thing that I recommend every person to do is install a basic protection for your devices, right? So install an antivirus, make sure that you don't get infected. If you do happen to fall for something you didn't realize, at least you can make sure that your device doesn't have it, right? So have an AV solution on your machine. And then the third thing is, get a privacy solution. Make sure that you're able to browse securely and your identity is protected when, as you're browsing online. So I think those are three simple things that everybody should do. Smart on social engineering, have an AV, have a privacy solution.
Well, just kind of staying on that theme of youth or whatever. Could you talk us a little bit about your immigrant experience to the United States and how you came here? What was it like for you? What were some of the challenges? What kind of immigrant family were you in?
Yeah, sure. So basically, my immigration story is my parents immigrated to the United States when I was 2 years old from India. And so, I'm a first generation American. I've been raised in the United States, but I've learned a lot from having immigrant parents and learning to live in, both the ideal culture that my parents came from and that they wanted to build their family around, as well as assimilating in the United States and balancing through that. So, my experience has been, I feel very fortunate for what my parents have done to raise us and inculcate a lot of the great things that I value about the culture that they came from, and also balance it with a lot of the things that you want from the American dream and having access to that. So
what part of America did you come to?
So my parents first came to Ohio where they were grad. And so that was obviously a challenging time for them to both be in grad school while having a toddler. And then they moved to California. And I've spent a good chunk of my life in California and the Bay Area.
So how old were you when when you first moved to California?
I was 5 years old.
Okay, so you spent pretty much your whole life, there. And so what was it like growing up in the Bay Area? when you were younger? Was it as, it's one of the most progressive parts of the United States now, but I'm sure there must have been some, challenges that you faced because of being slightly different, or was I know there's a huge influx of Indian immigrants to the Bay Area, especially now. Was that
Yeah.
present back then?
It was something that childhood, it changed. And I could see, both the places that I lived, as well as the inflow of immigrant population increased as I got older. So basically, I went from a where when I was in, elementary school to being different, if you will. Like from my appearance, from my cultural background, I stood out. To by the time I went to high school, there was, I was surrounded with a lot of people that were like me. It was a very interesting trend because I also, as I was growing, I got to see the Bay Area also change in terms of its demographics.
Yeah. Well, so here's one of the big things that, we've been all hearing about with the Bay Area. There's a lot of gentrification and, big tech is kind of taking up places. No, people have to move out because you can't afford. I think the poverty line in like San Francisco, the city, is something like $90,000. And I know that this isn't something, that you're an expert on or anything, but where do you see the future of, housing in the Bay Area? Are there like, amongst the tech people, are there solutions to work with the communities to make things more affordable?
I think the short answer is that the companies and the government, they have to come together to solve this problem, right? Because one of the things that's happened in the Bay Area is with tech, the cost of living has gone up. And for people who are not in the tech industry, for many of them, it's become unaffordable. And so there's many different ways to solve that. And I think, kudos to some of the tech companies who are helping in playing a part in trying to solve that problem. It is a complex problem. And like you said, Jacob, I'm not an expert on it. But some of the things that I think are essential to do is, we need to create more scalable housing in the Bay Area, for one thing, because the Bay Area, there's not a lot of high-rise buildings. There's not a lot of, opportunities for people, to scale with the population growth. The infrastructure in terms of transportation, other things, there's a lot of traffic, that, things of that sort. So I do think that technology can play a lot of role, a bigger role in making the Bay Area more livable for everyone, and also bring the cost down as we implement some of these solutions. The cost for living, the cost for transportation, et cetera, et cetera.
Now, so, pivoting this to, some more practical career advice. You got into MIT's business school, which is, extremely impressive. How important do you think, a top tier business school is in terms of cracking into not only tech, but also, the famous places like McKinsey, top tier consulting firms? And yeah, how important is that, big graduate degree?
I do think, look, it definitely helps. There's no doubt about it that it helps. But at the same time, it's not an essential ingredient. And I think what you get out of the big name schools is a lot more of the networking, the access to information, the advice, the mentorship. And those are a lot of things that I was fortunate to have and that helped me in my career. So I think that in some sense, the access to those things becomes a lot easier when you're in a big school. It doesn't mean that access is not there for if you're not in a big school, but sometimes you may, if you're not in a program or you're not in a school, you have to work harder and be more proactive to learn and find access to those things. So that's kind of where I think a school like MIT is terrific, because you get access to so many wonderful people, professors, research, ideas to technology, and that helps round you out as an individual. And it makes it easy to do that because you're surrounded in that environment day in, day out.
Yeah. Well, do you think there's a little bit of an unfairness for, because getting into those schools are somewhat arbitrary, or whatever, and it's obviously skewed towards more Asians and white Americans. So how do you think the future is going to look like with specifically those top tier institutions? And then also, I know, especially at least in banking, one of the conversations that we've had is that they're moving a little bit away from just extremely prestigious institutions towards using more, diversity programs. Is that something that's happening in tech?
It is absolutely happening, and I think it's much needed. And I'm so glad that we are moving to a model where, companies are more seriously taking diversity and inclusion as a key, key topic of or key theme that they're focused on, as well as corporate social responsibility. There was a day, Jacob, not too long ago, 10, 15 years ago, where a lot of board of directors, the primary thing that they would talk about was profit and loss and revenue growth, right? Those were like the two big pillars you talk about. But over time, what's happened is as we've become more modern in our boards, we started thinking about more issues. We start thinking about risk, right? Cybersecurity and risk. We start thinking about diversity, inclusion, corporate social responsibility, thinking about the environment. We're starting to move to a model where companies need to embrace all their stakeholders, right? Whether it's not just shareholders, not just employees, not just customers, but the environment, the communities around them. And so I'm really excited and optimistic about this trend that I see. And I hope that we continue to invest in it and bring more diversity and inclusion into the course, into the board, into the leadership. And it's also really important to note, Jacob, that it's not just diversity, right? Diversity is one aspect, but everyone who's there at the table should feel like they belong, feel included, feel part of it. And one of the things right now that happens is, even though there is some diversity, the diversity is not broad enough. It's concentrated in certain ways that some groups are still underrepresented. And so what we need to do is make sure that everyone is not only diverse, but also everyone feels included at the table.
Yeah. Now, so can you talk a little bit about like the dynamics of being an Asian American in these situations? Because, when we had the first African American female Black president of MIT, one of the things that's important to remember is that, I, as an Indian American, am, in these kinds of college institutions are sometimes overrepresented. So is that the case? And in tech, you see it a lot, a lot of the top tier CEOs of big tech companies are Indians. So what is the difference between, being an Indian in these kinds of at these kinds of, having a seat at that kind of table as being an Indian?
Yeah, no, it's such a great question. And it's one where I think, in many ways, like you said, in tech, Indian American is not an underrepresented, it's in some cases it's actually at par or maybe even overrepresented, right? So this is one of the things that I think as we think about diversity and inclusion, it's about leveling the playing field. It's about making sure that all voices are heard. And it's about, for a company, especially like a company like Malwarebytes, we're a consumer product company. So for us, it's also really important to bring in diversity of, to represent the type of consumers that we sell to into our thought process, into our product, and our user experience to make sure that it's accessible and works for all types of cultures and diversity is a key part of that. So I think it's important to be mindful of that and be more of an advocate. What culture you are. If you do have a seat at the table, be an advocate for diversity and inclusion, and that's the things that I try to imbibe.
And so, well, here's perhaps a controversial question. A lot of people who are Asian Americans and, white Americans, there's, Yale just recently had, a case come out that they actually, in fact, discriminate against Asian Americans who apply. And there is a lot of anxiety. I went to a predominantly Asian high school, or predominantly white and Asian high school, where there feels like, that they're getting passed on opportunities that they otherwise would be deserving for because of diversity programs. So could you talk a little bit about the dynamics of that situation?
Yeah, I think that is something that I can understand why certain people feel that way. But there's always, when you think about global diversity and inclusion and doing things that are best for the community, there's always going to be, some group or some representation that is going to be limited relative to creating space for the more diverse groups. So that is always going to be a trade-off. And I think the important thing is, as society, as leaders, as individuals, we need to be okay and understand why we're why we're deciding to do that. And it's not easy for that individual who might feel like they deserve that spot and they didn't get it, or whatever the case may be. But at a society level, at a nation level, nation state level, those are the right decisions and the ones that I think we need to make. The other thing that we need to do is also make sure that we do have enough opportunities for all our youth to succeed and have opportunities. Whether you get into school A or B or C, should matter less as long as you have an opportunity to go to a school, right? A top school. So this is the other thing is I think some people have a very strong perception, like I'm only going to go to one of these 3 schools. Well, I think one of the things we need to do as individuals is expand our horizons and think a little bit more broadly about and be thankful that in America, all of us, can have opportunities to get an education, to go to school, and diversity needs to help make sure that the right people are getting opportunities at the right levels and for the right fields and in the right institutions.
Yeah. Well, here's perhaps the $1,000,000 question. What is cracking the code like in McKinsey? Because it's one of the most famously hard places to get a job at. There's so many books that are written on just getting in, acing the interviews. So could you talk a little bit about your experience getting in and, advice that you'd give for potential college students and young professionals who want to transition there?
Sure. No, happy to. And I think I'll tell you a few things that you may not find in the books. But I think from my perspective, there's really 3 aspects to preparing and getting one of these roles. And the first is the prep. And like you said, there's a lot of things out there on how to crack the case, how to prepare for the case, how to practice with your peers on the case. So that part I think is probably the most well understood. The other 2 really where I think a lot of the difference comes from is as you go through the interview process. And I'm not going to deny the fact that the second element really is luck. There is some element of luck when you are interviewing against a cohort of really brilliant other people, and only a small number are going to be selected. There is some luck that comes into that, and I can talk to you about some of the luck that I was fortuitous for. And then the third piece I think is really a state of mind or an attitude around how you, or a presence, if you will. But it's almost like a presence and an attitude. And really, I think, a lot of people, as they go through the interview process, they're looking at candidates and saying, is this someone I can envision being a partner at this firm? Does this person exude the confidence, the demeanor, the presence that they could grow and stand in front of a CEO or a board member and have have the right conversation? So I think the third part is really the presence. So those 3 things all come together in the interview. And the second element is luck. And luck is a factor in this. So you got to do the hard work. You got to do the prep. You got to hope to get, some of the luck working in your favor and also have the right presence.
Yeah, so you you alluded that there is some luck in your specific case. Do you want to perhaps elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure. And so so what happened in my scenario was, I interviewed for McKinsey, and the first round happens on campus. So in Boston and Cambridge, I cleared the first round. And then the final rounds happen in the office where you're going to interview. So when I came in for my interview, I was so excited. And my very first interview of the day, I had a day full of interviews. My very first interview, I walked in and it was a case interview. And in the case, we had to solve some math, and I was doing some math. And the interviewer turned to me and said, "Hey, are you sure about your math? Are you sure?" I said, "Yeah, absolutely, I'm sure." And we continued to go through the case. At a point towards the end, I realized I'd made not 1, but 2 mathematical mistakes in my calculation. Now, making a mathematical mistake in one of these interviews is like a cardinal sin. It's like, and I made not 1, but 2. So at that point, I really felt like, right in the morning, interview number 1, in the back of my head, I was like, oh man, I really blew it. There's no way I'm getting this interview. So as I transitioned from my first interview to my next, I kind of told myself, I said, look, at this point, I'm not going to get this job, but let me enjoy the rest of the day. Let me try to make the most of it, see what I can learn. And my executive, and I really focused on more of my executive presence and trying to learn and have the most of it. And I had 0 expectations of what was going to come out of it. And I think the element of luck for me is, what I thought was a cardinal sin, something I would, definitely got rejected. I ended up still getting the job. And for me, that was a huge surprise, a shock, the next day when they called me and gave me that offer. A big part of it really was when I went into my final interview with the senior partner. It was a grueling interview. It was like one of the most grueling interviews I've been in, because the senior partner was trying to gauge, my depth and breadth of knowledge and how I stand my ground. And I thought that having the right presence was really important to overcome that. And so the luck was, getting a lucky break from some mistakes I made and having a strong supporter in the senior partner.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so, perhaps for a practical piece of advice for paying it forward, what is something you'd look for when you interview an applicant?
You mean at Malwarebytes or at McKinsey?
Just in general,
In general,
and
yeah.
maybe if you have a specific, trait, what is a degree that you could look for if you're someone who's getting into a place like McKinsey or a place like Malwarebytes? Anything you'd recommend?
The biggest thing that I would say is that one of the things that I really value, even when I was at MIT, is, there's a lot of very talented, smart people out there. But the people who stand out are people who, at least in my eyes, people who are humble, people who are willing to learn, people who are willing to iterate. The personality and characteristics of a candidate often can surpass what they know or don't know, or even their experiences. And so this is something I would encourage everyone, is to have a mindset, a growth mindset, a mindset of continuing growing and improving, and also continue to maintain humility no matter what you achieve in your career. So those would be my advice.
But would you have any very specific, like, should you learn to code? Should you, is there something you'd, specifically say this is the holy grail of skill that you need to have besides, humility?
Well, yeah. I mean, when it comes to like technical skills and other things, I think there is a broad variety of things. This is one of those things where there's no generic answer. There's no, unfortunately for your listener, there's no one generic answer like, hey, this is the one thing you should know. Reality is that depending on what your goal is, there's many different paths to get to that goal. And so one of the things that I would encourage a lot of younger people to do, especially college, is map out kind of where do you see people who are really successful and what have they done, and try to map out five or so paths of how people have transitioned to that. And so that way it just opens your horizon to understand how people go from A to B. What I did, and I learned for myself, was I really wanted to be a C-level executive. And when I came to that realization, I was in college or just becoming a software engineer. And there's many different paths that could have taken me to that. But I also wanted to optimize for things that I really wanted to learn in my career. And so I value things like, touring the world, making contacts with C-level executive, getting exposure to board of directors. And so I paved my path in a way where I went to business school and I tried to get into a top management consulting firm because I wanted those experiences. I wanted to grow personally and professionally in those ways. And that happens to be a path that also leads to where my goal was. There's other paths I could have taken where I didn't need to go to business school or didn't need to become a management consultant. But that's the path I chose because that's the one I was passionate about, and it helped develop me as an individual.
So here's another question. A lot of students are, the kinds of people who end up going to startups out of college.
Right.
What is the dynamic between choosing between a big company out of college versus a startup, and how does it look like on when you look at a resume, and if someone's worked at 2 or 3 startups versus someone's been at a management consulting place for 5 years, what would you how would you explain
that? And I really
then?
like this question. I was going to say one, Jacob, is that even my own scenario, this was kind of a dilemma or a question that I was asking myself when I came to Mellon as a computer scientist. Because on one hand, I had a phenomenal startup, and the startup was founded by another professor at Caltech. And then I had your kind of typical large company offers, right, from Microsoft and others. So for me, it was the same question I asked myself. And I think they're both of them, by the way, if you have those options, congratulations, because I think they're both terrific options. So kudos and pat yourself on the back before you before you make a decision. But the paths take you slightly different places. And so that's what I think you should be mindful of. What are the pros and cons of choosing an option? For me, the appeal of a startup was, you get to take on more responsibility. The company was going to be fast growing. You get access to a lot of the executives. You get to wear multiple. So for me, these things were very, very attractive about the ways that I wanted to grow. In a large company, some of the benefits were you learn a lot of the best practices. You work with a lot of engineers. You work across a lot of teams, a lot of functions. You learn a lot more about process and discipline. And you learn the interworkings of a big company. And there's so many of them. So those are a lot of really good things to learn. But it just depends on what things you want to prioritize to learn and where you see your career going. For me, I chose a smaller company route because I really wanted the opportunity to be more hands-on, to do more things, and also to play more roles. So that's what my decision-making came down to.
Yeah. Well, so here's our the final question I want to ask you is, Kamala Harris is a Bay Area Indian person who has just been nominated to be the vice president of the United States if Joe Biden gets elected. What is the sentiment like amongst the Bay Area Indian community right now, knowing that one of their own may be in the White House?
I think there's definitely a sense of joy and pride just around the representation, not just the fact that she's African American or Indian American, or but also the fact that she's a female candidate as well. So on the gender and diversity and inclusion that we talked about earlier, she represents so much of that. And so I think what it really opens up, not just for me, but I think for anyone, is the realization about the possibilities and the opportunities that America provides. And I think there is an aspect of being able to relate to someone like Kamala Harris based on her heritage and other things. But I think for me, the bigger thing is the possibilities and opportunities that this is going to create for the next generation of students and young children to say, there's nothing that holds me back. No matter what gender I am, no matter what ethnicity I come from, no matter what socioeconomic status, the opportunity in America is there to reach the very top of government. So I think the part that really excites me.
So what about just you specifically as being a 5-year-old kid who grew up in San Francisco? Is there any just personal joy just from that?
Absolutely. I mean, like there is some charm to that as well. But to be very transparent, I think for me, the joy is much more around the opportunity and the possibilities, and really this representing the American dream for every single person. It's a light of hope for anybody who's, no matter where you live, if it's San Francisco or it's wherever, but the possibility of what can unfold in America. That's really what's.
Any final pieces of advice?
For students, I think the one thing that I might say in closing is I think, when I reflect back on when I was a college student and kind of how my journey's evolved, the one thing that I'll say is that, a lot of times as students, we really focus on what's next or what's the next great thing. And my thought to you is to take some time and just reflect on where you are right now, because this is actually one of the best times of your life. You're going to look back 20 years, 30 years later and say, when I was in college or when I was going through this journey, it seemed so tough, but those were actually some of the best days of my life. So I just want to encourage all the students, enjoy this time, be fortunate to have this. And also some of the decisions that you're going to make, feel fortunate that you have the opportunity to think about these and make these decisions, because later on you're going to reflect and realize, these were some really precious times. And so enjoy the journey, not just the destinations. That would be my biggest advice.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your time and for being on the podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Jacob. Really appreciate it.